You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Asia House and the Barakat Trust, with the support of the Al-Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Welcome everyone, this is Saif al-Rashidi of the Barakat Trust, your host for this episode of our podcast series, and we're very happy to welcome Kareem Ibrahim, CEO of Takween Integrated Development, an Egyptian organization working on urban rehabilitation, cultural preservation in an integrated way. And today Kareem's going to talk to us about a project that he's been working on for the past number of years in Esna in the south of Egypt. Welcome, Kareem. It's so nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Saif.
Well, Kareem, I think for a place like Esna, which a few people of our audience know about, it would be good if you could tell us why it's historically significant.
Esna is a mid-sized city located 55 kilometers to the south of Luxor. And it's been constantly inhabited since the ancient Egyptian times. It was an important trade center during the New Kingdom, linking Egypt to Sudan. In the Greco-Roman time, it became a nome, let's say a capital in Upper Egypt, and it gained the name Letopolis, which is basically after the name of the Nile perch fish. And as part of this significance, during the Roman time and the Greco-Roman times, the most important monument in the city was the Temple of Khnum, was constructed between 180 BC and 250 AD, which lasted for almost like 430 years. And the temple was built for the god Khnum. Khnum was one of the god creators and creator gods in Upper Egypt. It's also known as the potter god that actually creates human beings out of clay. And also the significance of Esna continued during the Coptic era. So, for example, Esna was a place for Roman persecution in the middle of the 3rd century. So there are many histories about the Roman persecution and the number of martyrs killed by the Romans. And a lot of the city attractions, including the Monastery of the Martyrs, the Monastery of St. Matthew the Potter, the Church of Mother Dolaji, they are all buildings that actually bring the memory of the martyrs. And until today, a lot of Coptic Egyptians, they visit these places because of these memories and the painful memories, actually, in the Coptic history. It also continued to play an important role during the Islamic era. So Esna is the place of the Amria Minaret, one of 5 minarets built in Upper Egypt by Badr ad-Din al-Jamali during the Fatimid time. And an Amria Minaret is almost 1,000 years old. It was built in 1081 of the date. And the significance of the minaret, besides being one of the first 5 minarets to be built in Upper Egypt, is that the foundation inscription of the minaret, which I think exists within the Luxor Museum, uses for the first time the word Mu'adhana, linked to call for prayers, to describe the structure other than Manara, which is actually minaret. So it's this almost the first time the word Mu'adhana is mentioned officially in this sense. In the Ottoman era, political struggles were something that had its impact on toll in the city itself. The region of Qina, or like Esna is southern city of this region, was playing an important role during this era between the 13th and the 18th century, including the Ottoman times. So there are 3 main powers. The Mamluks, or like a lot of Mamluk adversary, fled to Upper Egypt, was not fully under the control of the Ottomans. Secondly, the Ottomans themselves, which actually had the ruler in the city of Girga, and also the tribes of Al-Hawara, which mainly controlled this region at that point of time. And the importance of this region was not only political, but also commercial and in terms of trade. This region was part of 2 main trade networks. The first is called the Indian Ocean Economic System, which is basically linked between India from the east to Morocco in the west. And at the heart of this system was the region of Qina, where, for example, you could have found the best coffee in the world coming from Yemen, or very high quality sugar and goods that actually have been traded with the rest of the world. The second economic system is called the Sub-Saharan Caravan Route System, which is actually linked sub-Saharan countries through Darfur and Sinar in Sudan to Darb al-Arba'in, leading up to Asyut in this region, but also passing by Esna through what we call Darb Dosh, which is actually a route that is coming out of Darb al-Arba'in. All of these reasons made Esna a prominent place and a place where Mamluks can actually settle and practice their political and economic influence, such as Hassan Bek al-Giddawi, for example, who built the Wakalat al-Giddawi in 1792, one of the most prominent buildings in the city that still remains until today.
So basically, it's on two main trade routes, right? One going up and down the Nile, and the other one going east-west, which is basically an ocean and then a land route.
That's correct. So Esna was playing the role of the southern gate. It was responsible for the trade with Africa.
So it must have been a remarkably wealthy place.
Indeed, that's what you notice in the mansions and the quality of the buildings that still remain until today. But not only that, in the early 20th century, Esna was the place for building what is called the Esna Barrage in 1906 during the reign of Abbas Hilmi Thani, and this is one of the main barrages in Upper Egypt, including the one in Aswan, in Esna, and Asyut, to control the Nile flood. And this was the major work of engineering that actually built in the city. Also, Esna remained as a directorate or a mudariya until the late 19th century, and later on it became part of the larger region of Qina. And it continued to play an important role until the early 20th century, where like Luxor started to gain more momentum and rise, especially in the end of the 19th century with the tourism industry, and where Luxor became a more important city. This continued until the mid of the 20th century, and in the 1990s, tourism started even to decline further in Esna after the construction of the new barrage built by the Egyptian and the Italian governments in 1997. So we had less tourists visiting the city afterwards.
So it has a pretty long, uninterrupted history of being a significant place.
That's correct. And this is where you can see it. If you're going through the city, it's full of hidden gems and signs of this kind of wealth. You can like enter a small alleyway and you find a magnificent mansion, or you pass through a gate and that looks very humble. But inside you find a really prominent building with wooden lintels, woodwork, very elaborate woodwork, for example, and construction techniques. These are things that showed the wealth of the city, in fact, and actually how it continued for centuries to play this important role.
Okay, thank you. Well, can you tell us a bit about the economy?
Esna has two major economic activities that actually continued for centuries. Firstly, it's agriculture, and agricultural economy is one of the main pillars of the city economic activities. And you can see that there are activities that are driving from that. For example, oil pressing is one of the activities that has been known in the city for centuries. Another activity, which is a bit more of a recent activity, is drying tomatoes. Esna has some of the best tomatoes in Egypt. And the second main activity is trade. And what we mean here is regional trade. Esna is a trade center not only for the city dwellers living there, but also like the surrounding villages. We're talking about like 500,000 inhabitants living around the city of Esna. And most of them, they buy their goods, they buy their stuff in the city. So it's basically, this is the place where you can equip a newly with bride or something like this, where you can buy good galabeya, for example, or you can buy textiles and household stuff. So it's basically like a trade center. The third element, which is much lesser influence, is tourism. So it's basically, Esna is famous for the temple, but it's not really fulfilling its full potential on this level.
Well, you're an architect, and I'm interested to know, just in summary, how do you think Esna's architecture reflects its social customs and traditions?
Firstly, we should start with the urban fabric itself. It shows very well how the city and its fabric has been affected and actually reflecting the functionality of trade. So the city consists of a main spine, which is basically called the Qisariya market. This was the main commercial spine that actually had the different trades of the city. The spine actually intersects with the temple, where there is a marketplace or a big open space in front of the temple that was the main marketplace for the city and still plays a functional role within the urban fabric itself. And this is where you can find also like the third type of this kind of influence, which are the wakalas or the qisariyas over there. We have Wakalat al-Giddawi. It's an 18th century building overlooking the main square over there, which used to be the marketplace. So that's from an economic point of view. But from a social point of view, you can see that there are, if we look carefully into the urban fabric itself is subdivided into small quarter. And each quarter, it's occupied by a family, a prominent family from the city. So family of Shanqir, family of Huzayn, family of, for example, Mujahdiya. So these are like prominent families that have been living in the city. And you can find that there are concentrations of their properties around what we call the diwans. And the diwans are public buildings or public facilities that are actually used for public gatherings in terms of, for example, if you have like a wedding or if you're having a funeral or whatever, or even social gatherings during Eid time or during Ramadan. So these are places for the families themselves to gather and actually receive visitors and see others in these places. And you can find them scattered around the city. In terms of architecture, that also reflected on the buildings themselves. We have magnificent woodwork actually on most of the buildings, especially dating back to the late 19th century and early 20th century, where you find a lot of wooden balconies and, more importantly, wooden door lintels. The door lintels were so important because they have inscriptions. Sometimes these inscriptions are coded. So there is something called Hisab al-Gummal, or some kind of calculus where you can actually use a cipher and you can decipher the script on the lintels to know the date of construction of the building. And many of these buildings, they have this kind of like inscriptions, whether mentioning the date or who actually renovated the house and so on and so forth. So these are like all reflections on the city architecture and urbanism.
Thank you. It sounds like a really fascinating place. Actually, I know it is because I've visited before, but it sounds wonderful from your description. Well, what made you choose to work in Esna, and what are the general aims of your project?
Esna is an example of mid-sized cities in Upper Egypt and in many places in Egypt. And in fact, we feel like these such cities are neglected from scholarly work, neglected from investments. There is little known about these cities. And the same happened to us when we started working in Esna. We found a city that was in physical and economic decline. That was back in 2010 when we were commissioned by the Egyptian government to develop an upgrading plan for the area surrounding the temple. So we saw a typical case of declining historic city center that is basically suffering from physical and economic disinvestment. And we, in addition to that, it was suffering also from a building moratorium because the existence of the temple in the middle of the city imposed some planning regulations and almost like a complete freeze on any investments in construction or even infrastructure. So it's basically the city was frozen in time because of the existence of the temple. The authorities wanted to preserve the temple, but because of lack of any upgrading plans at that point of time, nothing was moving in the city. Adding to this, that tourism started to actually decline since 1997. And the reason for that was that because of the barrage built in 1906, Nile cruises crossing the Nile from Luxor to Aswan, they used to stop in Esna for almost 12 hours. So tourists were going to Esna because they had nothing else to do. Staying in the ships, they had to visit the city. In 1997, the Egyptian and Italian government, they constructed a new barrage that enabled the ships to cross in less than an hour. So it became optional. So it's basically no tourists were stopping by Esna, and we'll explain this later. Why was this happening? So basically, there was this kind of decline and disinvestment that we found in the city. But what we found also is a place of multi-layered history. It's one of the very rare places where you can, one place in one street, you can find a Greco-Roman temple, 1,000 years minaret dating back to the Fatimid era, an Ottoman time Wukala, 19th century houses, 20th century mansions, very rich social and economic networks actually that are active in the city. So it's something that's really unique. Many of the Egyptian cities, they had this kind of diversity, but Esna is one of the few places where this diversity still manifested and still preserved in time. So it's an example of neglected small towns that have great potential.
Well, if you could tell us about the project, that would be great.
Okay, so in 2016, we started a project that was funded by the United States Agency for International Development in partnership with the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities and the Governorate of Luxor and the Ministry of International Cooperation and CID Consulting. We worked together into a project called Rediscovering Esna's Cultural Heritage Assets. And it's basically was to focus and try to come up with an alternative model for tourism that can work within the city and bring economic benefits to its inhabitants. The project was very successful. It lasted between 2016 and 2020. And that encouraged the different partners to go into a second phase of the project called Value Investment and Sustainable Integrated Tourism in Esna. The acronym is Visit Esna. And through this project, we aim to develop and promote a sustainable and integrated cultural tourism model that can be replicated in other cities as well. So I'm trying to put Esna on the tourist map by doing three things. First is preserving the city's diverse cultural heritage assets. And second is to develop high-yield tourist products. So it's basically that can generate income for the local residents. And third, promoting the city as a unique and prime tourist destination. And the aim of that is to lead to increased tourist revenues and local economic benefits. So in terms of increased employment, business opportunities, culture in the cultural tourism sector and the city. So this is what we aim to do through this project.
Well, I'm interested actually in the people of Esna and how they responded to an organization like yours coming with a project in mind. In what ways did they initially respond, and how has their perception of what you're doing changed over time?
They were skeptical at first because the city has been suffering from neglect from a long period of time. And basically, it was part of the newly established Luxor Governorate. The Governorate was still young, it had its own priorities, and the city hasn't been developing over the past period of time. So people were somehow, when we came in and we said we're going to do so and so, like we're going to work on like upgrading existing houses, upgrading the local markets over there, the Qasariya market and so on, they didn't believe us at first. And we understand that because it's basically their expectations have been raised several times without real action on the ground. But with collaboration with the Governorate and the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, we've been able to implement several interventions that actually for the first time started to take the public investments in this sector and cultural tourism from, at least in the city, from places like the temple or the Wakala to places that are directly connected to the local residents. For example, local houses with architectural significance, the local market over there, the Qasariya market, which is actually a market serving the local residents, not tourists only, and the oil press. And all these are sites of significance to the community that meant a lot to them. To see, firstly, that something is changing in the city, and secondly, it is something that's directly related to their daily lives. And basically, that started to create some kind of trust and credibility for us working over there.
Also, one thing I remember when I visited Esna with you some years ago, it was initially difficult to get people to rent their houses to outsiders like yourselves, and sometimes they were reluctant. What do you think that reflects upon the relationship of people to the city, and how has that changed?
This is one of the challenging areas because the local culture is different from other places. So it's basically there is a lot of pride in ownership of buildings because buildings mean much more beyond owning a piece of real estate. It actually embodies the history of the family and the customs and traditions of the certain family and a group of people. And they take a lot of pride in these buildings. Firstly, they are well off economically, most of these families. And that's why there is no motivation for them either to lease or sell these buildings. This is something that we're still struggling with. But we're hopeful with little cracks in the system by encouraging the younger generation to see their properties and buildings, especially the ones with the architectural value, with a different lens and basically try to explore ideas where such buildings can be used to provide either facilities for the tourism industry or to be engaged part of the local economy or even to work in businesses that are serving the local residents. So we're very aware of that, and this is part of our second phase of the project where we are focusing now on the economic activities and actually to show models that can work, creating partnerships between the owners and maybe some of the successful businessmen from either from Esna, from Luxor, from Cairo, and so on and so forth, to create this kind of partnerships around these buildings.
Well, also, I notice on social media, which is excellent in terms of the project that you're doing, that now you've started to restore people's houses and the transformation is really remarkable. And I wonder to what extent this transformation gradually has encouraged people to want to take part in your project.
They have already taken part in our project in the first phase. So when we did the work in Qasariya market, we had substantial financial contributions from the business owners and shopkeepers to restore their shops. It's basically when you show them the path, show them that there is a hope for the place that is going to be restored, because one of the issues that are happening in the city, that is still we're in some kind of ambiguous situation about whether the city is going to be, or like the city center is going to be restored, it's going to be entirely removed and people are displaced. Nobody was actually certain about the plans for it. Luckily, the government started to adopt some of our approaches, and hopefully there will be more clarity in the future. So to create this kind of what we call like security of tenure. When people feel secure, when they feel that their investments will not go in vain, I think they will be more encouraged to restore their buildings. Secondly, we showed something that's very important, that these kind of traditional buildings can be restored and can have another life, a new life. And one of the, let's say, unintentional results from the restoration of the Wakalat al-Gadawi, this 18th century building that was in a truly dilapidated condition, was the feedback from the residents. We didn't expect that. All of them came back to us and they said, we never thought that such a building can be restored. And we use this as an example right now, is that because now they take pride in such a building, they visit it heavily by the local residents, by schools, by school trips and youth. And all of them, they couldn't believe, especially the ones who've seen the building before, that such buildings can be restored. So we're hopeful because we're showing some good examples, and hopefully with more of these examples, with additional funding, with let's say sustainable activities over there, we're hopeful to restore more and more of these buildings.
So I suppose one of the good things about your project is that it's enabled people to see their environment differently and to realize potential in things that perhaps they wouldn't have seen potential.
That's correct.
Well, you also mentioned the urban fabric and the preservation of the urban fabric as being an important thing, but you mention it in a way as if it isn't obvious to others. And I wondered whether your approach is different from a traditional approach to tourism development in places like Esna. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
If we're talking about the tourism model, we need to see the bigger picture. Like the urban fabric of Esna is one of its, let's say, great potentials. The city has a lot of potentials. We have a very unique urban fabric that has been intact at least for the past century. We have photos from the 1920s that show that very little change happened in the city since then. We have this multi-layering of historical eras in one place. We have a great location between Luxor and Aswan. We have magnificent local and very unique local community that actually interacts with tourists in a very peaceful manner. And we have the restored building. So all of these are assets for the city and actually to create some kind of a different model. And but if we're talking about a different model or an alternative model of tourism, we need to understand what are the characteristics of the current model. Unfortunately, Egypt is, I don't think, is at least until very recent time was going the right path on in terms of tourism industry. So we had a model of what we can call enclave tourism, especially in Upper Egypt. And it's a type of control where tourists, they pay a ticket coming to Egypt in what we call the all-inclusive package. The all-inclusive package, you can pay 500 euros, 600 euros from Europe and spend a week in Egypt, all-inclusive, including the flight, including the hotels, including all your meals, was almost paying nothing in the country. So that's something that is actually brings tourists in terms of numbers, but it actually doesn't benefit the local community. So tourists are walking around according to a very tight schedule where they have very little opportunities to interact with the local community. So they hardly see local people. They visit temples, they visit museums, but they don't interact with the local community. So it's an exclusionary model. So it excludes communities, and it also excludes the diversity of the cultural assets of a place like Egypt. If you look at any map of Upper Egypt, you find that almost temples. And there is nothing about local communities. There is very little about a historic city in Upper Egypt. This is something that's not very common as a terminology. So basically, to us, it's an outdated model. So if you look at modern, trends, it goes to something called sight doing versus sightseeing, which means that you need to do activities in the places you visit. You need to do something where you can interact with the local community, where you can have a quality experience. But so far, we're just focused on sightseeing. So talking about our alternative approach, it's to go with what's really happening nowadays in terms of sustainable cultural tourism. There are many drivers for sustainable cultural tourism. Some of them, there are economic drivers where you can bring benefits to the local community. You should focus on the rich content of the site itself, which is basically something that's not only Esna, but many Egyptian cities are privileged with. You have to have social goals, so tourists should be linked also to enhancing social and economic opportunities for the community. You should focus on market differentiation. So it's basically, if you're marketing Esna as a temple, you wouldn't be doing much. And this reflects directly on the figures. So in 2019, which one of the highest years where we received visitors in Egypt after the 2011 revolution, Egypt received almost 13 million visitors. Out of these 13 million visitors, only 1.2 million visited the Karnak temples and the main attractions of Luxor. That almost half of this figure, 600,000, went down to to the south, to Aswan, passing by Esna, Edfu, and Komombo. These 600,000, almost all of them stopped in Edfu, in Komombo, and Aswan, and only in Esna, 60,000, which is even less than 10% of the people visiting Aswan. It means that we're capturing very little number of people in Esna, and it's basically because we're promoting this city until today as a temple. So people are fed up with seeing temples in Luxor. They need to see something different, and they need to do something different. And this is what we're trying to do in Esna.
So can you give us a summary of the kind of things that hopefully once your project is developed and completed, the kind of things people will do and see that are beyond the temple?
There are two main pillars for what we're doing. First is to develop what we call a quality visitor experience. It's basically, if you want to have a quality visitor experience, you need to achieve 5 things, and these are the things that we're working on. Firstly is to have a good physical condition of not only the buildings and monuments that you're visiting, but also the infrastructure around them. So the streets, the roads actually leading to these attractions and sites. So this is one thing that we're working on, is to restore as much as possible of the buildings surrounding the temple and the area. Secondly is to actually focus on the cultural significance of the site. And this is something so people actually would have a value perception or perceive the value of the site itself. And this is something we're trying to work on by conducting research, understanding oral histories, bringing actually the hidden narratives around the city itself, which leads us to the third point, which is interpretation and information. Availing information on site is very important, and it is linked directly to the kind of research we're doing. So we're producing a lot of promotional materials, tourist guides, a tourist map, actually bringing to the surface these hidden gems of the city and its surroundings. The fourth point is to have quality services. So this is something that's completely lacking in Esna. So while we managed to achieve a lot in terms of restoration, but if you come to the city, it is difficult to find a place to eat or like stay there overnight or like have a good cup of coffee or even a public toilets that they are missing except for the Wakala building. So this is something we're working with them, like the different governmental authorities and the local businessmen in Esna to make sure that they are available, not only for tourists, but also for the residents of the city itself. And finally is working on the soft skills of people who you meet over there. So basically, bazaar owners, business owners, how they can deal with tourists, understand cultural differences, how to treat visitors, and so on. So this is the first pillar, which is the quality visitor experience, and these are the areas where we're doing interventions. And the second element is the improving the local economy through bringing economic benefits to the local residents. And this is where we're trying to come up with innovative models of site doing. It's basically, if you can go to the oil press, for example, instead of listening to a narrative how it worked, you can actually press your own oil and take it away with you. You can go to, let's say, we have historic farms that are around the city where you can go and pick your own fruits and take them home and understand the history of the 19th century farms around the city, for example. So to be engaged with local experiences around the Nile, around the places of the city, you can even wave your own scarf. So all of these are activities we're trying to create where people can experience the city and learn by doing stuff that they have actually no other similarities in the surroundings, for example, in Luxor or Aswan or whatever. So these are the two things we're trying to achieve over there.
It sounds like a really thoughtful and intelligent and beneficial way of approaching tourism in Esna. And I wondered, given that this is not a very conventional model, as you say, in Egypt, how easily is it being received by, say, local authorities? I mean, is it something that people are welcoming with open arms, or is it still a challenge to implement?
It is challenging. I think we have achieved a lot in terms of changing the perception of the city from a temple to a fully fledged historic city. This is something we were not hoping to achieve this quickly, but through working with the local officials hand in hand and from the very first moment of the project, we've been able to conduct a lot of what we call capacity development activities on the job. Basically, the ones who are the patrons and the protagonists of our plans to preserve the city are the antiquities inspectors, for example, which actually were against our ideas in the beginning. But working together with them managed to change the perception and hence changing the perceptions of the upper levels of decision making around the city. We were lucky of having a visit from the Prime Minister in last October, where he visited the city and supported our approach. Now the government is pledging almost 250 million Egyptian pounds to upgrade the city and revitalize it according to a plan we provided them with. Still, the model is difficult to change because if we're talking about the existing model around tourism, it's a global industry. It's not only about Egypt, it's about how Egypt is part of a larger tourism network globally. And to change this model from a model that is very exclusive, that is actually working for a very few number of people, to bring more benefits to the local community and trying to change that, this is a very daunting task. So Esna is, to us, is a test lab. It's a place where we are trying to show people that if we can approach tourists differently, we can achieve better results. Let me give you an example. Conservation and restoration rehabilitation works we're doing, we're following an approach that is relying almost 100% on local labor, untrained labor. We train them, we bring our own team, and we train the labor instead of bringing in qualified contractors from Cairo or whatever. We insist on doing the business slowly but surely by incorporating local manpower. And up to date, we've created almost 40,000 man days of labor in Esna. This is one of the most appreciated, let's say, contributions of the project. The result is now we have qualified personnel over there. Just like this week, one of our restorers is restoring 19th century minaret owned by one of the families over there in the city on their own. They started this dynamic of actually restoring their own legacy by the hands of the city residents over there. So it's basically we're showing that we can really bring local benefits and economic benefits to the community by changing the mode of operation that we're working with and creating a different experience for tourists. That's something, and visitors, because we're not only focusing on foreigners, but also Egyptians to know part of their important history in Upper Egypt.
It sounds really inspiring. And I wondered if you could tell us just briefly how you managed to convince antiquities inspectors who only thought of the temple to seeing that Esna was more than that.
Yeah, this was a bit tricky because we've been trying to change a model that has been around in the mentality of official minds since the 19th century. And basically, it was an exercise of valorization. We used very simple tricks to do that. Very, very simple. You wouldn't imagine how simple they are. We used photography exhibitions. We used sketchers, urban sketchers, and invited them to the city. And we had public exhibitions on the streets. We printed the photos of the attractions of the city, the significant buildings, the things that actually the regular eye in Esna wouldn't notice. And we started distributing these photos to everyone, the tourist police, the antiquities, the governor, the local residents, the city council. It's actually, if you enter the city council of Esna right now, you'll find a huge wall with photos of the different attractions of the city. This was not there before. And believe it or not, this was a very significant eye-opening process. When we were showing these photos to the officials, they were like, the first question they were asking, is this Esna we know? It's like, does these things really exist in Esna? Even for the local residents, they were saying the same. They were not seeing these things except through the eyes of others. And I'm talking about Egyptians, I'm not talking about foreigners. Then we started a process of discussions with like the local residents and the local officials. And gradually they started to perceive is what they have, even in their homes, like the papers, the letters they have at their homes, like the things they inherited from their families are of value. And these are things that are actually, it's a history, it's a living history of their city. And basically it actually dictates who they are and why they are unique actually within this context. And through this, they started to see this process differently. Thirdly, we started to present solutions, either by restoring the existing buildings and showing them they can become something that's really significant and beautiful when they are restored, but also engage them with us in the design process itself. So for example, in 2018, we conducted a big workshop in Esna to work on the bazaar area, linking the Nile to the temple. One of the most problematic areas in this city is completely dilapidated, but holds a lot of potential and actually can be upgraded in a way that there are different interests that are conflicting there between the bazaar owners, the antiquities who want to clear the site, the governorate, tourist police. We brought everybody on board. And we did this story design workshop where everybody was engaged. I can never forget when we were showing the results of the workshop to the antiquities inspectors over there, and they were saying, this is the first time someone asked us about our opinion. And the result was not a lip service. What they did is that they took our proposals and they took them through the official letter of approvals within the Ministry of Antiquities, and they got us an approval without even asking them to do it. They just came back to us with an approval of the plans to upgrade the city and restore it in a way that is more sustainable. Nowadays, we work with the antiquities inspectors who are like the ones who are responsible for listing and documenting more than 100 significant buildings in the city. And it's not their job. Actually, it's basically they volunteer to do it after working times. And now they create like a huge report of significant buildings in the city leading to their listing actually by the authorities. And they are the ones who are now actually searching for this kind of, we've been showing them a different model in the city, and now they're showing us their city through their eyes, and which is something really exciting.
One other question, Kareem. Given your long experience in Esna and other places, what do you think, in summary, is the most effective way of dealing with the historic environment?
It's contextual, but I tell you some of our experiences over the past 2 decades in dealing with historic areas and places like Egypt. First is that you need to have a comprehensive vision. You need to understand that this is change in historic areas. It's about a process. It's not a project or a product that you end up with in like a couple of years. It's a long-term process that is ongoing for almost decades of change and upgrading and management. You need to have an in-depth understanding of the potential and challenges of the place you're working with. You need to take small steps to test models, and then if they are successful, you can actually scale them up. You need to consider the fine grains of historical and the socioeconomic fabric. We've been in Esna for 13 years and we're still learning and understanding in such a small city, but it's a learning process for us until today. You have to have a community participation element while you're working, because without the community and not for the community, you're not really achieving anything. It's the community benefits are the end goal of this kind of activity. You need to have an inclusive economic growth approach. And last but not least, you have to focus on governance. Governance is so important because you can come up with the most beautiful upgrading plans and the best restored buildings, but without a sustainable management system and good governance structure within the city, you'll be achieving nothing.
Thanks. That's a very useful summary. I could listen to you for hours and hours, but Kareem, I'm going to ask you to summarize by just saying 2 short things. Given your Visit Esna program and your Visit Esna slogan, what message would you tell people about Esna who might consider coming?
This is a unique experience that people haven't been through before. It's one of the very few places in Egypt where you can find this kind of rich history, diversity, and something that is totally unique and that has been unknown for us as Cairenes, for example, living in Cairo, away from the center. That tells an important part of Egypt's history. Over time, not only ancient Egyptian or Greco-Roman, but it's actually how mid-sized cities, there have been a place for social and economic interaction and historical events that we're not fully aware of. It's part of our history that we're not aware of, and this is an opportunity to explore that.
Even though we can't see you, we can feel your enthusiasm and your conviction, and I think it's a moving and a wonderful thing. So thank you so much, Kareem, and I hope to visit Esna again with you, and that I hope many of our listeners will also explore as you encourage them to do so.
You are most welcome, and hopefully we can have you again one day with us. Thank you, Saif.